There's a political party that's shaking Germany to its core. A party so despised by so many that when it meets for its national convention, thousands of people protest outside. A party so far to the right that it flirts with the language of extremists on immigration. A party seen as such a threat that elements in it are under official surveillance. A party that had to dump senior figures accused of ties to Russia and China. A party so controversial that all of Germany's mainstream parties say they would never work with it in government. In fact, a party with leading members who downplayed Nazi history, going too far for the most powerful leaders of Europe's far right. And yet, despite all this, it's a party that's thriving, saying it's the only true alternative to a failing establishment.
Denn wir sind die Alternative.
Die Alternative für Deutschland.
Für Deutschland!
This is the Alternative for Germany, or AfD, and millions of Germans are voting for it. The AfD is vying for political dominance in Germany's east, where the communists once ruled. In the European Parliament in Brussels, it's now Germany's second biggest party. But its real goal is national power in Berlin. And its leaders tell us they're playing a long game, and they're on track to a future in government.
Also ich glaube, realistisch wäre es ab dem Jahr 2029.
There's been nothing quite like this in Germany since the Second World War, and many Germans seem transfixed by this, either horrified or inspired by what they see. But what's getting less attention is what this party actually wants, particularly when it comes to foreign policy, what sort of a world it wants, and Germany's place in it. And you know what? If anything, this party's vision is more radical than many realize. So this is a deep dive into the worldview of the AfD. We speak to the co-leader of the party, Alice Weidel, its foreign policy spokesperson, Matthias Moosdorf, and its most powerful regional leader, Björn Höcke. In part one, a profound rejection of American leadership.
Die gesamte globale Sicherheitspolitik der USA ist doch ein Modell, was wirklich von gestern ist und nur noch Konflikte zeitigt.
We dig into the AfD's views on NATO and the Western Alliance and the deep questions they raise about war and peace in Europe. And in part two, the AfD and the East. We unpack why the party wants to end support for Ukraine and connect the dots to a focus on Eurasia, tying Germany closer to Russia and beyond, all the way to China.
Putins und Russlands Interessen wurden über 20 Jahre ignoriert. Das ist nun mal Fakt. Deutschland sollte den Schwerpunkt darauf legen, weiterhin gute wirtschaftliche und diplomatische Beziehungen zu China zu halten.
All this based on a foundation of putting Germany first and rejecting the European Union.
It means we go out of that union and we cut all the financial supports to that union, and we talk about 30 billion euros a year.
Wir stehen für die Interessen Deutschlands ein und nicht für die Interessen eines anderen Landes.
And if they were carried out, the AfD's ideas would transform Germany's relationships. International experts tell us how.
That would be an ideal opening for Russia, and that would be very much Europe that Russia would want to see.
From China's worldview, the AfD's perspectives fit right in.
They're not even clear whether they would honor Article 5 and defend countries like Poland or the Baltic states in the future.
If Germany didn't come to the defense of the Baltic states, that is the end of the transatlantic lines.
So there's a fine line to walk between the nationalism that I think is an expression of health and the nationalism that is isolationist and anti-Western at its core.
I want to tell you about a couple of ground rules that we set for this video. When we talk about the AfD's positions, we primarily refer to its most recent manifesto, from the European Union elections in 2024. We also refer to the AfD's foundational policy document, the Grundsatzprogramm, from 2016. We'll always flag up what we're quoting from, and of course we'll refer to those interviews that we did with top party leaders. And there's one more thing. We're conscious that the AfD is a highly charged issue for many here in Germany. So we decided to only speak with experts who have no electoral skin in the game. None are German nationals. You see, this isn't merely a fringe party in any country. This is a growing political force in the most powerful nation and the most powerful economy in Western Europe. What happens here matters for the future of the Western Alliance. Let's get started. Ramstein, Germany, one of America's biggest foreign bases. A key center of US power and the whole transatlantic alliance. It's part of a network of US bases in Germany set up in the Cold War. Together they host tens of thousands of US troops. They intertwine with Germany's own bases, one of which houses American nuclear weapons in turn. This is a nexus of Western military power, and the AfD says those nuclear weapons and soldiers need to go. The party's foundational policy document, its Grundsatzprogramm, says this.
The AfD calls for the withdrawal of all Allied troops stationed on German soil, and especially their nuclear weapons.
Alice Weidel is the co-leader of the AfD. We asked her why her party wants to take such a step.
Der Krieg ist sehr nah und dementsprechend wollen wir die volle Souveränität zurückhaben der Bundesrepublik Deutschland und auch mögliche Gefahrenpunkte uns zur Zielscheibe zu machen, sofortig abbauen.
The war Weidel is referring to is Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but this policy was published years before that. It's about something deeper, and it raises questions about Germany's whole future in NATO. NATO was formed out of the ashes of World War II as the victorious Allies split between democracy and communism.
Press and delegates welcome the chief representative of a new member nation, Dr. Konrad Adenauer, Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany.
Germany was the front line of that split. The West joined NATO in 1955.
And Western unity was immeasurably strengthened.
Judy Dempsey is Senior Fellow at Carnegie Europe.
This was anchoring in Germany, West Germany, to the post-1945 institutions, and I think it was hugely important.
A week later, the Soviets formed the Warsaw Pact, with East Germany a founding member. This was the framework of the Cold War, a deep, systemic conflict that came to be symbolized by this, the Berlin Wall. West Germany was a crucial member of the Western Club, getting rich and building up a big military, all under US protection, even with American nuclear weapons on its soil. When the Cold War ended, there was talk of the end of history. The threat from Russia seemed to disappear, and German military spending dropped fast. AfD leader Alice Weidel says it fell too far.
Die Sachlage ist so dramatisch, dass die Bundesrepublik Deutschland momentan nicht mal in der Lage wäre, unser Land zu verteidigen.
The freedom to slash military spending was called the peace dividend, and it was partly made possible by continued US protection. More countries decided to join NATO, and bases like Ramstein took on new roles, supporting US and NATO operations far away, like in Afghanistan and Iraq. The AfD sees operations like these as breaking with NATO's remit. The party's foundational policy document we saw just earlier says this.
Membership of NATO corresponds to Germany's foreign policy and security interests as long as NATO limits itself to its task as a defensive alliance.
And skepticism in the party runs deep that NATO is not just about defense. We spoke with Björn Höcke, the AfD's most powerful ideological force in Germany's east.
Spätestens der Jugoslawienkrieg 1999, also der völkerrechtswidrige Angriff der NATO auf das Gebiet des ehemaligen Jugoslawien, hat bei mir ein Umdenken eingeleitet.
What Höcke is referring to is NATO's intervention in the Kosovo War, aimed at preventing ethnic cleansing. Russia and China opposed the mission, which went ahead without a mandate from the UN Security Council.
Ich musste dann in den folgenden Jahren beobachten, dass die NATO von einem Defensivbündnis immer weiter in Richtung eines Offensivbündnisses zur Durchsetzung von Macht- und Rohstoffinteressen missbraucht und weiterentwickelt worden ist. Und das ist eine Tendenz, die nicht gut ist. Eine NATO als Defensivbündnis ja, aber nicht als imperialistisches Handwerkszeug.
This is not an isolated view. The AfD's EU election manifesto of 2024 says this.
The geopolitical and economic interests of the US are increasingly diverging from those of Germany and other European states. We reject any dominance of non-European superpowers in European foreign and security policy.
And Alice Weidel says Germany would be safer without US nuclear weapons on its soil than with them.
Ja, absolut. Absolut. Die Interessen der USA innerhalb von Deutschland widersprechen diametral unseren Sicherheitsinteressen.
Let's digest that for just a moment. Alice Weidel is saying that US and German interests are diametrically opposed. And she's underscoring this policy of withdrawing US nuclear weapons. This is both strong rhetoric and dramatic policy.
It would certainly trigger, I think, questions, even doubts about the credibility of the American nuclear deterrent and Germany's commitment to it.
Peter Rao is director of the Center on Europe and Eurasia at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C.
Moreover, I think there's probably an assumption embedded in the AfD's proposal that those weapons would go back to the United States. But the United States and, say, Poland are two sovereign countries, and one could easily imagine that the U.S. would redeploy forces further to the east, including potentially adding in new nuclear weapons sharing countries in Central and Eastern Europe.
And sure enough, in Warsaw, US troops and nuclear weapons would be greeted with open arms.
If you don't want them, we'll take them. I'll start with that.
Katarzyna Pisarska is chair of the Warsaw Security Forum.
But talking seriously, I think there's first and foremost a fundamental misunderstanding and also underappreciation how Germany has been able to prosper and flourish thanks to the American security umbrella over the years. The fact that Germany did not have to spend money for its own security, did not have to worry about being invaded by countries, that we could have created a safe European Union, one of the most prosperous areas in the world. And NATO and Article 5 was truly, and I hope still is, the bedrock of European security. This is why countries like Poland and the Baltic states decided to join NATO.
One of those Baltic states is Lithuania, where fears of Russian aggression are growing. That makes this region more focused than ever on NATO's Article 5, the promise that an attack on one member is an attack on all. Germany has now underscored that promise by lining up a major military presence in Lithuania. Backing up Germany's boots on the ground, those American nuclear weapons. But the AfD's foreign policy spokesperson Matthias Morsdorf casts doubt on all of this. He says that in reality, the US would not honor its commitments.
From my understanding, the US government would only acting if the aggression is against the homeland of the US and not Europe.
So you don't believe in America's commitment to Article 5 in Europe?
Not in the case of nuclear answer of any aggression from outside.
That's the thing with Article 5. It's never been truly tested.
Today, the question is whether the Americans will want to continue to provide this security. This is the real issue. And if they step away, step down, as I understand AfD would want to, who's going to fill that void? Who's going to fill that void? Is that going to be Germany filling in that void? Or will we see actually other powers like Russia, like China?
NATO leaders always insist they will defend every inch of its members' territory.
Sometimes we do beat our chest in the West and talk about the inviolability of Article 5. The real rubber hits the road moment is in extremis, if such a contingency takes place. Would the United States, would Germany be prepared to fight their way into the Baltic states if, say, Putin managed to quickly suborn one of those countries, set up an anti-access area denial bubble, and threaten a nuclear counterstrike if the US and NATO fought their way in? That is not an easy contingency to think through, and I think we should be sober about it. But if we begin to sow doubts about Article 5 at the very beginning, then I think that only emboldens and encourages the likelihood of such an intervention.
So what about those German troops in Lithuania, such a clear demonstration of Article 5? Would the AfD stand by the guarantees that they represent?
If Russia did take some kind of hostile action towards the Baltic states, Germany is committed under Article 5 to step in. Do you think it should, or do you think that would be against Germany's interest?
I think it should not, but of course it's contracted. Yeah?
He sounds less than wholehearted there, and the fear from Germany's eastern neighbours is that the AfD would leave them hanging.
All this is extremely worrying. We read this as, on the one side, trying to undermine our trust in whether the Americans will actually deliver on Article 5, which is existential for the security of the Baltic states, Poland, and the entire Central Europe. The AfD is also undermining our country's trust in Germany as a reliable ally and a reliable partner. And these kind of statements very clearly favor one party in Europe, and that is Russia.
We put these fears to Alice Weidel.
Ich habe vollstes Verständnis für die Haltung Polens und der baltischen Staaten. Das ist auch historisch begründet. Also Polen wurde nicht nur einmal überrannt. Und dementsprechend ist das Sicherheitsinteresse auch dieser Länder absolut verständlich. Auf der anderen Seite glaube ich, dass Putin niemals ein Interesse haben könnte, dort freiwillig einzumarschieren. Warum sollte er? Dafür liegt überhaupt gar kein Grund vor. Das sagt er auch explizit selbst.
But those who know Putin well are not so sure. Alexander Gabuyev heads the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center in Berlin.
If Vladimir Putin, a couple of years down the road, wakes up one day and believes that he has the strongest army in Europe, that he stands next to the Baltics, and if he enters the Baltic, nobody will risk a nuclear exchange with Russia, and that will show that Article 5 is futile, and that will lead to rearrangement of the European security architecture because NATO will fall apart. So if Putin thinks that one day and gives marching orders to his general, will there be anybody in the situation room in the Kremlin who will say, Mr. President, that's a crazy idea, we will definitely not follow your order? The answer is no.
It's an alarming scenario of where Vladimir Putin could be heading next. Alexander Gabuyev says that to prevent it happening, the West would have to invest much more in NATO's eastern flank.
I think that it's a very high impact but low probability scenario for now. But the longer Europe doesn't invest into deterrence capabilities, focusing on the Baltic states, Finland, and like all of the countries that are on the eastern flank first and foremost, the tail risk of this scenario actually materializing is increasing.
Okay, let's take a minute. We've heard a lot about what the AfD doesn't like. Its deep criticism of the US and its skepticism about NATO. So does that mean that it wants to leave NATO? We put that question to Alice Weidel. And despite all of those criticisms, she said no.
Es macht absolut Sinn, dass Deutschland Mitglied in der NATO ist.
And that's in line with public opinion in Germany. Instead of calling for leaving NATO, Weidel talks about strengthening its European arm, referring to ideas expressed by French President Emmanuel Macron.
Hatte sehr stark dafür plädiert, die europäische Sicherheitsarchitektur zu stärken. Darin sind natürlich alle europäischen Staaten enthalten und sollten an einem Strang ziehen, da unsere Sicherheitsinteressen andere sind als die der USA.
But Weidel goes much further than Macron, with outright condemnation of the United States.
Die gesamte globale Sicherheitspolitik der USA ist doch ein Modell, was wirklich von gestern ist und nur noch Konflikte zeitigt. Ich halte das für einen absolut falschen Weg.
So what does the AfD want to do about defence? Well, there are pointers in the 2024 EU election manifesto. It talks about establishing a European defence community and achieving military and strategic autonomy. We asked Matthias Molstoff to explain.
Let's look in the perspective of the next 10 to 15 years. I expect that we can go forward with much more sovereign architecture of an own security understanding in Europe. You know that we want a Europe much more focused on national states. And of course they can do agreements. Probably we need one agreement in the case of security.
The manifesto goes on.
The AfD rejects a European army and is committed to a fully capable Bundeswehr as the cornerstone of German sovereignty. With strong armed forces of its own, Germany can be put in a position to replace the US forces on German soil in the medium term.
And how strong would Germany's military have to be to achieve this? Would it even need nuclear weapons? Alice Weidel told us that military spending would need to be above the NATO target of 2% of GDP, but she didn't specify how much, and she categorically ruled out nuclear weapons.
Dass in Deutschland sowohl Atomwaffen stationiert sind oder für Atomwaffen ertüchtigt werden sollte, steht für uns und für mich persönlich außer Frage. Auf keinen Fall.
But other figures in the party seem much more open to the idea.
At the end of this way, we have to talk about do we want to develop nuclear weapons in Germany as well? Because it's the last question of a list of very long questions in a row.
Wären Sie auch für eigene Atomwaffen, für eine eigene Entwicklung von Atomwaffen in Deutschland oder in Europa?
Also das ist sicherlich eine Frage, die diskutiert werden muss, gerade wenn man eine europäische Verteidigungsgemeinschaft auf dem Schirm hat. Und langfristig brauchen wir in Europa tatsächlich so eine Möglichkeit, ja.
So it's clear what the AfD is against. US influence, US nuclear weapons on its soil, US troops on its soil, the US projecting its power through Germany. But the plans for what would fill that gap leave many questions unanswered. Would Germany stay in NATO? What would a European defence community look like? Who would be in it? Would it have guarantees like Article 5? Who would have nuclear weapons? In capitals like Warsaw, this is deeply unnerving.
I cannot talk about other security guarantees for the European security architecture, not knowing who would be behind them, whether Germany, and of course with its weak military abilities, with its lack really of military experience even, I don't know how Germany could substitute the United States of America in Europe, and especially in our region. Yes, in our region, Central Europe, that is directly threatened by Russia, and that can truly ponder an invasion of Russia into the Baltic states, but maybe even in the future into Poland.
Others also warn of anything that falls short of NATO.
That would be an ideal opening for Russia, and that would be very much Europe that Russia would want to see, where Russia would be able, as the largest outside security presence and a very large economy next door, also interconnected to Europe through myriad various ways, provided with an opening to be much more influential in Europe, build coalitions, build clubs inside, and really be the towering force inside European continent.
The shadow of Vladimir Putin looms over all this. As we see in part 2, he has a crucial interest in all these debates. And potentially, this man does too. It's June 2024. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is in Berlin. He speaks to the packed-out parliament, thanking Germany for its help in the fight against Russia's invasion. But some seats are empty. This is where the AfD lawmakers usually sit. Only 4 of them showed up out of 77. The rest staged a boycott. We spoke to one of them.
We were afraid that this would be a show to ask even for more money and so forth.
It was a clear rejection of the role that Berlin has played in supporting Ukraine. After the US, Germany is the second biggest provider of weapons and funding to Ukraine, and trains Ukrainian soldiers on German soil. Berlin argues this is both the right thing to do and critical to European security. That's been a profound break with a long-standing German policy of not shipping weapons into war zones. In the past, it's been the left that's pushed hardest against this, but now the AfD is making the issue its own.
Das, was gerade in der Ukraine gemacht wird, ist eine Aggressionspolitik und hat mit Verteidigung wenig zu tun.
The AfD's European election manifesto calls for a total change of course, pivoting to policies that would please Vladimir Putin.
Weapons supplies to war zones do not serve peace in Europe. Restoring uninterrupted trade with Russia requires the immediate lifting of economic sanctions against Russia.
These are definitely the Kremlin's talking points. I don't think that AfD necessarily adopts them because the Kremlin tells them or they read that, but they genuinely believe that Ukraine is outside of the tent. Germany has benefited enormously through its economic cooperation, and that sending weapons to Ukraine is just a big burden on the taxpayers. Like, why do that?
Underlying this is the view in the AfD that while Putin's invasion of Ukraine is undeniably illegal, his motivations were understandable.
Der russische Angriff ist absolut völkerrechtswidrig, das steht hier außer Frage. Nur die Sache ist ja jetzt die, wie löst man das? Russland hat sehr genau gesagt, wo die roten Linien liegen, und zwar in der Aufnahme der Ukraine in die NATO. Russland hat ein Interesse daran, weil Russland eine 1300 Kilometer lange Grenze zur Ukraine hat, dass die Ukraine in einer Neutralität verbleibt, sozusagen als Sicherheitspuffer dient. Und diese Interessen wurden sträflich ignoriert über 20 Jahre, als der NATO-Bereich immer weiter ostwärts verschoben wurde und eben gegen vitale Sicherheitsinteressen von Russland verstoßen hat.
It's a narrative that Germany's eastern neighbors angrily reject.
It is not about the fear of NATO. If it were the fear of NATO, then we would have a huge army, Russian army, on the Finnish-Russian border. And actually, since Finland joined NATO last year, the Russians withdrew from the Finnish border. So if they think that NATO is such a threat, why are they withdrawing from borders with NATO countries? Maybe because they know that Finland will not attack Russia. Maybe they know that Poland and the Baltic states will not attack Russia.
But Alice Weidel says she believes that NATO and Russia are on collision course.
Deutschland muss sich vor allen Dingen für Friedensverhandlungen einsetzen. Weil, um es hier auch ganz klar zu sagen, ich habe die größte Sorge, dass dieser Krieg eskaliert. Der hat so ein hohes Eskalationspotenzial. Und ich habe das Gefühl, dass von der europäischen Führung als auch von den Amerikanern nicht im geringsten, nicht mal im Ansatz die Gefahrenlage hier verstanden wird, wann die rote Linie für Russland eigentlich mit den ganzen Waffenlieferungen, mit Soldatenausbildung, mit der finanziellen Ausreichung, dann mit der Ausreichung von Panzern, dann noch von Raketen, wann die rote Linie überschritten wird.
Experts do acknowledge these risks.
I think the threat of escalation is very real, and I think here the AfD leadership is onto something that it's getting more dangerous. I think I would disagree that the West is blind to that. I think that the people I'm talking to are fully aware of that and are just trying to calibrate support for Ukraine without providing more dangerous incidents and keep the channels of communication open to the Russian.
But there's skepticism that negotiations anytime soon can produce a lasting peace.
The thing is that the Russians believe that time is on Russia's side. As long as Vladimir Putin believes that more time will deliver him more gains and his leverage will be stronger, there will be no interest to seek in a peace that's durable.
For Weidel, the key is finding a new relationship with Russia, even including it in ideas for the future, like those we heard about in part 1.
Ich glaube, dass Russland in sämtliche europäische Architekturen perspektivisch eingebaut werden sollte, damit solche Störfälle nicht mehr passieren. Das ist völlig klar.
But for Warsaw and capitals across Europe, Putin's Russia has ruled itself out as a constructive partner.
People who believe that you can include this regime into discussions about a European security architecture are completely delusional. In December 2021, so not even 2 months before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia proposed its security guarantees, the vision of its European security architecture. And the vision was very clear. Move away troops, NATO troops from Poland, from the Baltic states. So basically already telling us what to do, telling Ukraine to be completely neutral. What Russia wanted is that Ukraine could not join the European Union. And having a kind of concert of nations, of the big nations like Germany, France, and the US, and deciding how to divide Europe. This is for Europe unacceptable. We have lived through that history. This is past history, and countries like my own will not agree that somebody else will decide on our security. We've done that 30 years ago. We will not repeat that.
There are more signals that the AfD tilts towards Russia's view of the world. Let's zoom in on one example.
We call for adhering to the principle of non-intervention in the internal affairs of states by other powers and non-state actors.
Now, this is where China comes in. This idea of non-intervention in the internal affairs of other countries sounds a lot like talking points that you hear from Beijing.
China would welcome hearing that from a major German political party. This is very much aligned with China's understanding of the world.
Amanda Xiao is senior analyst for China at the International Crisis Group.
It does not want Western governments to be looking closely at how it handles its affairs internally, whether that's related to the way it treats minorities on its peripheries in Tibet and Xinjiang, or in Hong Kong, or in Taiwan, which it also considers to be a part of its internal affairs.
Taiwan is the most sensitive issue right now between China and the West. The West sees Taiwan as a thriving democratic society whose people have the right to decide their own future. For Beijing, that's nonsense. It sees Taiwan as part of the People's Republic of China, and nobody else's business. We asked Alice Weidel what she thought.
Ich glaube, was für die Bundesrepublik Deutschland gilt, dass wir dort überhaupt gar nichts zu suchen haben. Es liegt nicht in unserem Interesse, uns dort einzumischen. Darum sagen wir ganz klar, wir mischen uns nicht in die Angelegenheiten anderer Länder ein. Ich glaube, dass der Volksrepublik China Raum eingeräumt werden sollte, diesen Konflikt mit Taiwan selbst zu lösen und zu einer sehr, sehr guten Lösung zu kommen, im gegenseitigen Einvernehmen.
The problem is, China's vast power means experts see little hope of such mutual consent.
I think Taipei would say it's not possible to reach a mutual and equitable agreement with China on the dispute if the two sides were completely left to their own, because really Beijing has become increasingly aggressive in its approach. That's been the trend, right? It's shown very little sensitivity to Taiwan's concerns and preferences. The tendency has been for China to become, as it grows in power, increasingly inflexible, hardline, and imposing in its demands.
That makes Taiwan highly dependent on military and moral support from the US and others. For Alice Weidel, that's a recipe for disaster, with America chiefly to blame.
Wenn es dort knallt und dort auch weiter rumgefuschelt wird von amerikanischer Seite, da sollte man sich wirklich zurückhalten und diesen Partnern, diesen Parteien den Freiraum einräumen, es selbst zu lösen und nicht noch irgendwie Öl ins Feuer zu gießen, wie man das im Nahen Osten auch gemacht hat und in der Ukraine. Das Ganze geht doch alles nach hinten los.
Here you can see a worldview crystallizing further. That the turmoil that we're seeing in Ukraine and the Middle East, and that might yet come to Taiwan, has one root cause: the United States. And that's precisely the view in Moscow and Beijing.
The AFD's views on Taiwan would be music to the ears of decision makers in Beijing. You know, it's implying that the US meddling is the reason for why tensions are rising in Taiwan, which is exactly China's narrative, that the involvement of Washington is what is stirring up what Beijing calls secessionist forces in Taiwan.
Over in Washington, D.C., a possible war over Taiwan is a scenario that's taken very seriously. There's no expectation that Germany would join a fight over Taiwan, but there are serious doubts that it would have the luxury of sitting on the fence.
On the first days of war between China and the US, thousands of dead Americans, presumably, potentially American ships at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, American submarines potentially hit. If in that case, Germany essentially tries to strike an equidistant pose and say, well, Taiwan is like Crimea 2014, we should carry on and continue our normal relations with Beijing as if nothing much has happened, Americans would remember that and they wouldn't forget it, and they wouldn't forgive it either. And so for that reason, I think it would behoove, the AFD, but really all of German politics, to think long and hard about the implications of an all-out war. If it's an actual combat between the US and China, then I think Germany will have to choose. And that would mean, say, economic embargo against China, or drastic economic measures of that sort.
And yet the AFD's EU election manifesto preempts that scenario, saying this:
"We oppose any possible sanctions against China."
The message? The AfD wants to keep business with China humming along.
China ist der wichtigste Handelspartner Deutschlands und Deutschland sollte den Schwerpunkt darauf legen, weiterhin gute wirtschaftliche und diplomatische Beziehungen zu China zu halten.
Those business ties were largely built up in the era of Angela Merkel, when geopolitical stresses were less in the foreground and business boomed with China and Russia.
Various European leaders have beaten a march to Beijing to try to negotiate positive trade deals for themselves. They've also, over the years, worked closely with Moscow. That includes the major parties, the legacy parties in Germany, the CDU and the SPD. So, in a way, it is a little bit rich and hypocritical for the criticism to rain down on the AfD from the same actors who otherwise surreptitiously cut deals with Beijing and Moscow in their own national interest.
But times have changed, and there's a growing consensus that Western economies, and Germany in particular, have become too dependent on China. The AfD rejects this, though, and if you read its policy documents closely, you see that it wants to deepen relations with China even further.
With its new Silk Road project, China has embarked on a project of the century, In order to be a player on an equal basis, the AfD calls for Germany's active participation.
The New Silk Road, China's giant global infrastructure project, also known as the Belt and Road Initiative. Germany joining would be a bombshell.
In this moment when China is facing immense pressures from the West, one of its goals is to really try to create a bit of space across the Atlantic between the US's positions on China as opposed to Europe's positions on China. A part of the goal is to also create and deepen divisions across Europe so that Europe is less likely to form a united bloc that is keen on increasing its competition with China. So a Germany entering into the BRI would be a huge coup for the Chinese, given this larger strategic landscape.
There's more. The AfD says it wants to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as an observer state. It's a regional body also led by China. And there's this too.
Germany should expand relations with the Eurasian Economic Union.
If you haven't heard of the Eurasian Economic Union, it's controlled by Russia. Its other members, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, and Belarus. Building ties with these bodies starts to look like a pivot from west to east, from the transatlantic world to Eurasia.
If I have this proposition to become observer at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, join Belt and Road Initiative, and then engage meaningfully with the Eurasian Economic Union, that would be a gift to Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping by extension, because that will boost legitimacy and content of these institutions and organizations.
The AfD's position on China is very much in line, really, with China's views of the world. They would be very welcomed in Beijing. The argument that the US-led security order is a relic of the Cold War era and creates global instability is exactly the sort of narrative that China itself has been putting forward. Beijing is also seeking to create more space in the court of international opinion for the idea that China itself, as a major power, is a legitimate alternative provider of peace and security.
That's the geopolitical reality out there. China and Russia are challenging the Western alliance. And Germany is such a core member of that alliance that any questioning of where it belongs is a very big deal. In part 1, we saw the AfD's doubts about US power and NATO. And now we've seen its openness to Russian and Chinese worldviews and institutions. All of this is built on the AfD's political foundation of skepticism about the European Union. The party's founding policy of ending Europe's single currency, the euro, was the origin of the party name, demanding an alternative for Germany. And this remains today.
Only through national currencies can every state regain sovereignty over its economic and monetary policy.
And the manifesto condemns the European Union as a whole.
We believe that the EU cannot be reformed and see it as a failed project.
Alice Weidel says she wants a Europe of fatherlands instead.
Das, was dort geschaffen wurde, die Kompetenzuntergrabung parlamentarischer Demokratie in den Nationalstaaten, halte ich für einen falschen Weg. Das ist aus meiner Sicht zutiefst undemokratisch. Und dementsprechend wollen wir ein Europa der Vaterländer, souveräner Staaten, Kompetenzrückbau.
You can hear echoes of the arguments about sovereignty used in Britain in the run-up to Brexit, its decision to leave the European Union. Brexit caused huge disruption, and in our interview, Weidel wouldn't say whether she wanted Germany to do the same. Others, though, are less cagey about a German version of Brexit.
It's called Dexit. It means we go out of that union and we cut all the financial supports to that union, and we talk about 30 billion euros a year.
This sense of resentment about Germany getting a raw deal runs through many of the AfD positions that we've looked at. A raw deal from NATO, a raw deal from the US, a raw deal from Europe, and a sense that there might be better deals to be had elsewhere. So, what now? Well, the years ahead could amplify all of this. Germany's status as a manufacturing powerhouse is in question, thanks to geopolitical disruptions in its energy supplies and intense competition from rising exporters like China. On top of this, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed Germany's military weakness, showing it will need to spend far more on its armed forces in the years ahead. In facing each of these challenges, you can see the temptation of looking east, that it might mean cheaper energy, better deals with China, a rapid end to the war in Ukraine, putting tensions with Russia to rest. For those watching from the Kremlin, this would be Germany truly embracing its national interests.
I think that they see AfD as the German patriots who are genuine, who frame the security interests of Germany in terms of national interest, just looking poor at Germany. The hope is that over time, the grim reality will swing more voters towards this point of view, and that the German common sense will say, oh, that's exactly what we need for our country. And I think that Putin and the Russian foreign policy elite genuinely believes that this is the outlook that suits German national security interests much better than the current one, and Germans just need to be smarter and not fully colonized by the Americans.
And that has been Russia's goal all the time, consistently, from even before the Berlin Wall collapsed in 1989. The whole idea was to consolidate the relationship between Germany and Russia in such a way that it would actually weaken the security and the defense structures of Europe, which are exemplified by NATO.
And the view from America? Don't blame us for your troubles, and don't join the other team.
It's a painful time in Germany, but this isn't because of the United States. Joining a series of institutional bodies which are clearly meant as counterbalances or anti-Western organizations goes against where Germany is positioned, which is as part of the West, as part of the free world.
Germany's closest neighbor to the east is Poland, a country devastated by the Nazis, a former vassal of the Soviet Union, now a crucial member of NATO and the EU. And it's there in Warsaw that you hear the strongest pleas for Germany to stay on side.
Any ideas of leaving the European Union and leaving the Eurozone and so on means the total destruction of the single market itself, of our ability to trade with each other. It goes back to protectionism, goes back to nativism, goes back to nationalism. We've been there and it didn't work. These ideas brought 2 world wars, which cost the lives of 100 million victims. And this type of completely selfish looking and transactional looking at world affairs will not bring anything good to the Europeans.
Berlin was the epicenter of 20th century history here in Europe, of both those world wars and the Cold War that followed. Now, with a new geopolitical contest unfolding, Germany is crucial once again. Where does it belong? Does it believe in its alliances and institutions? Are there better alternatives? The questions raised by the AfD are fundamental, and Germany's choices will be consequential. Watch this space.